That night, everything inside me shattered into silence. The music vibrated through the walls of the room as if life were celebrating, as if nothing could hurt, as if happiness were a mandatory uniform in that impeccable setting. I held the champagne glass like someone holding a rope about to snap. And it did. He emerged from the crowd with a smile too confident, too trusting for someone who hadn't even been invited. And she looked at him as if she'd already expected it. When he pulled her in and kissed her in front of everyone, as if I were invisible, time stopped for a second that lasted an eternity. There was no scandal. No one screamed. No one pushed her away. The party continued as if nothing had happened, as if it hadn't been there that my world had first collapsed. The only reaction was my exit, firm steps, dry eyes, and a dignity that, though torn, still walked by my side. I left behind the woman who promised to love me, respect me, choose me every day. And that night, she chose something else. It wasn't just a kiss. It was confirmation of something that had probably been happening for a long time. It was the period she decided to write in the middle of my sentence. And I just left. She came to me the next day with tears in her eyes and a trembling voice, as if she still belonged to me. She said it was a mistake, that she'd gotten confused, that she didn't know what she was doing. I stood there, trying to understand where in our story love had turned to doubt. She called me by name as if that were enough to bring back everything that no longer fit. But I no longer belonged to that pain. I no longer recognized that face that looked at me, begging for a time that would never return. Love, sometimes, dies like this, in a stranger's kiss, at a crowded party, in a moment that dismantles an entire life. I didn't scream, I didn't fight, I didn't cry. I just walked away again. And this time, from within her too. Time passed as it does when we're no longer in a rush. Day after day, I silently rebuilt myself. I discovered new music, new coffees, new routines. I discovered a new reflection in the mirror, more serious, lighter, more mine. I discovered that self-love has a bittersweet taste, it hurts at first, but then nourishes like nothing else. And then, when I was no longer looking for anyone, she appeared. Not with promises, not with games, but with presence. A serene gaze that didn't demand strength, a complete presence that chose me naturally. She didn't want to heal my wounds, just show me that it was possible to walk again without bleeding with every step. With her, I understood that love isn't a shout, nor an urgency. It's a daily choice. Silent. Firm. And that's why it's so strong. While I was learning to be truly loved, the other part of my story was lost within my own regret. The woman who once promised to be mine tried to piece her life back together like someone trying to glue together the shards of a vase that fell in slow motion. She tried to find in other eyes the reflection she once had in mine. But in all the new faces, there was the same absence, no one looked at her the way I did. No one waited for her with the same patience. No one insisted with the same heart. Little by little, I began to understand that betrayals have consequences beyond words. That there are losses that life cannot restore. And worst of all, that time does not heal what was violently torn away. Time only transforms pain into memory, and that memory hurt more than any silence. She tried to love again. She tried to convince herself that she still deserved a fresh start. And indeed she did. But the problem was that, with every fresh start, the end always felt like me. Silent comparisons, absent gestures, promises that sounded too shallow. One by one, the relationships she sought fell apart like sand through her fingers. Because what she lost wasn't just a man. It was the chance to be loved by someone who still believed that love stood the test of time. That kiss at the party was, for her, just a fling. But for me, it was the end of the world. And when the world ends for someone, it doesn't come back the same. Years later, our paths crossed again. I, with the calm eyes of someone who no longer holds a grudge. She, with the weight in her gaze of someone carrying a regret too old to explain. There were unspoken questions. There were choked apologies. But there was also a new silence between us, the silence of acceptance. She asked for forgiveness. Not as someone hoping to rekindle something, but as someone who needs to breathe again. And I forgave. Not for her. But for myself. Because holding a grudge against someone is like chaining yourself to a past that's already passed. And I didn't want to live there anymore. She smiled with wet eyes. She said she hoped for my happiness. I wished the same for her. And for an instant, we were once again two hearts that once truly loved each other. Today, she's with someone else. Someone who might not see her the way I do, but who arrived when she finally understood the value of being chosen and choosing. Someone who might be lucky enough to live with the version of herself that learned, that fell, that lost. And who now knows what she wants. And I'm still with the one who showed me that true love doesn't ask for permission, it simply stays. We both move on. We both heal. We both understand that not all pain is punishment, sometimes it's just life's way of teaching. But that night at the party, when it all began, something inside me knew nothing would ever be the same. The kiss in front of everyone was just the trigger. The truth is, the story had been crumbling for a long time. Small gestures ignored, conversations interrupted, empty looks at breakfast. I just didn't want to see it. Or maybe I wanted to believe that love endured even when it was hanging by a thread. And the strangest thing of all is that, years later, on a random afternoon, she herself confessed it. That she had already lost herself even before she cheated. That she only realized how much she loved me when she could no longer reach me. And then I ask myself, why do we do this? Why do we throw away those who truly love us in exchange for a moment of illusion? Maybe there will never be an answer. Maybe some stories need to end badly so that we can learn to love better later. But what happened between us, that wasn't just betrayal. It was a broken mirror reflecting all the mistakes we avoided facing while there was still time. What if I told you that one day she came back, with tears in her eyes, and asked me, would you still have chosen me if I hadn't done that? What do you think I answered? Welcome to the channel. Here, we make one thing clear, we do not support any kind of betrayal. Never, all the stories you will hear are fictional, but based on real pain, created to show how betrayal can destroy homes, hearts and destinies. This channel is a mirror of the truth, where every choice has a price. Now take a deep breath, and get ready for a story shocking, intense and impossible to forget. They met simply, on a cloudy autumn afternoon, in a cafe on the way between her work and the bookstore he frequented. There was no instant magic, no background music, none of that kind of connection that movies insist on promising. There was just a curious look, an unpretentious exchange of words, and a silent desire to know more. And perhaps precisely for that reason, it worked. It wasn't love at first sight, it was love as the days passed. It began with the way she smoothed her hair as she listened, and the way he stirred his cup as if drawing invisible circles of calm. And there, in that everyday world, they built something that seemed so solid it was fearful to touch too hard and ruin it. His name was Daniel. A discreet man, with a slow voice, one of those who think before responding and who always seem to carry some interesting story in their memory, even if they never tell it. He worked in project planning and was the kind of person who writes everything down, not out of a control freak, but out of respect for time and commitment. She, Isabella, was pure intensity. She had a lively intelligence, a gaze that captured nuances, and a way of laughing that was contagious even to those in a bad mood. She worked in advertising creation, which seemed perfect, considering how much she saw poetry even in the city traffic. They complemented each other in a way that didn't seek the spotlight, just peace. Daniel gave her the stability she lacked, and Isabella breathed new life into him with every conversation. Friends said they seemed made for each other. And maybe they were, at that stage. Together, they built a routine that smelled like home. They shared mornings of warm bread and freshly brewed coffee, long, aimless Sunday walks, and silent late nights reading or just being there, together. They had the kind of connection that didn't require much fuss. A look was enough to tell the other was tired, or sad, or simply in need of a hug. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. The kind of love that makes you want to grow as a person, not lose yourself in the other. They lived in a small apartment, with walls covered in paintings and mementos, and a worn sofa that bore witness to almost every phase of their relationship. They argued sometimes, of course. And like any royal couple, they also faced periods when fatigue spoke louder, when communication seemed to fail, and when the noises of the world seeped through the cracks of their home. But even in the most difficult moments, there was an invisible agreement between them, not to leave in the midst of the storm. Daniel knew when she needed space, and Isabella understood when he needed silence. They respected each other's boundaries, and perhaps that's why it all lasted so long. During the first years, their relationship grew deeply rooted. They shared plans, travels, mistakes, and achievements. They built memories that seemed impervious to time. Their families grew closer, friends grew accustomed to seeing them together, and the cycles of life began to shape themselves around their existence. There was, indeed, a deep feeling there. Not just love, but admiration, companionship, care. When he received a promotion, she celebrated as if it were her own. When she won an award at work, he looked at her with the same glow as when he first saw her. They created a home in the deepest sense of the word. Isabella had a restless soul. Always seeking something new, always reinventing herself, always with a new project in mind. Sometimes this took her out of her routine, made her more absent, less present in the small details. Daniel understood, but never held her accountable. He trusted her. He trusted her because he knew she was like that his love didn't lie in constancy, but in the choice to return home. And she always did. Or almost always. Over time, as with any long-term relationship, adjustments came. Daniel began working in a more demanding field, with suffocating deadlines and many short trips. Isabella was promoted, gained visibility in the corporate world, and began attending larger events, important dinners, and meetings with people who seemed to have come from another universe. Their routines began to no longer fit together so perfectly. They ate dinner at different times. They went to bed at different times. Conversations became more about agendas than feelings. They still loved each other, but they began to drift apart without realizing it. She felt lonely sometimes, even though she loved him. He felt tired, even though he was happy. Intimacy turned to silence. Kisses became rarer, hugs more formal, and touch no longer came as frequently. Not because there was no desire, but because time was running out, and habit began to replace affection. Still, there were moments of tenderness that reclaimed what they both knew still existed. But there was something new, invisible, haunting them both, a certain absence disguised as normality. That year, they decided they needed to reconnect. They planned a short trip, just the two of them. But a company event came up that same week, and she couldn't cancel. He understood. And she promised that after the party, they'd take a few days to be together. And that's when the world slowly began to tilt. No earthquakes. Just that feeling that something was about to collapse, even if no cracks were visible yet. The promises continued to come, but they no longer came with the same sparkle in their eyes. Daniel began to notice details. Small changes in her tone of voice. Messages that were responded to more slowly. Smiles that didn't reach her eyes. And inside him, something began to unsettle, as if a forgotten part of his soul was screaming that it was being left behind. But he didn't accuse her, didn't confront her. Perhaps out of fear of hearing a truth he didn't want to hear. Perhaps because he believed it was all just fatigue, pressure, the weight of a cruel routine. Isabella, for her part, struggled with feelings she couldn't name. She felt guilty for feeling disconnected from a man who had always loved her loyally. She feared she was changing, that she was losing something inside herself. And she tried to convince herself it was just a phase, that everything would return to normal. That this turmoil inside her was merely a reflection of a life that was too hectic, a job that was too demanding, expectations that were too high. But deep down, she knew, there was an empty space growing where peace once resided. During the week of the party, Daniel spent more time alone than usual. He prepared the house to welcome her after the event, bought her favorite wine, even chose an old movie they used to watch together. There was hope in his every gesture. A sincere desire to see her smiling just for him again. Isabella, on the other side of town, was getting ready in front of the mirror with a confused look. She knew the event was important, she knew she needed to be there. But something inside her weighed heavily. As if she were going somewhere she no longer recognized. As if she were moving away, even without wanting to. There was no betrayal. Not yet. There was a silent disconnect, a chasm growing between them without warning. A love struggling to survive time, absence, and wear and tear. But at some point that night, fate would put everything to the test. And nothing, absolutely nothing, would be the same again. What happened at that party, in that single moment when everything was turned upside down, that moment is yet to come. And when it does, none of their certainties will withstand the impact. Because some choices mark us forever. Some mistakes cannot be erased. And some forgivenesses are costly, much more than anyone imagines. That morning, Isabella woke before the sun. The apartment was silent, the loudest sound coming from the kettle she'd put on the stove as part of a routine she'd already made automatic. Daniel was still asleep, his face turned to the side she usually lay on, his features serene, oblivious to the fact that, inside her, chaos was growing by leaps and bounds. She watched him for a few seconds, trying to remember exactly when she'd last loved him with the same fullness as before. It wasn't heartbreak, nor was it indifference. It was a kind of emptiness growing where once there had been certainty. She knew he was a good man, the best she'd ever known, but in the last few months, she'd felt as if they were speaking different languages, trying to translate feelings that no longer found synonyms. She made the coffee the way he liked it, placed the cup next to the note with a "Good morning, love," written too quickly, and headed to work, her soul in a state of waiting, as if something were about to happen, even if it had no name. Daniel woke up some time later and found the note, just like any other day. He smiled slightly, but the feeling of distance between them remained, like a thin curtain he couldn't decide whether to shield him from the light or hide him from the truth. He tried, in small ways, to rekindle their connection. He arrived early, prepared dinners, sought out conversations that escaped the routine. But her response was always vague, present in body but absent in soul. He didn't say it, but he felt it. And he didn't press, perhaps because he still believed that all true love can find its way back, if there's patience. The week of the party, their lives moved at a strange pace. Isabella spoke little about the event, as if to protect that space from a possible invasion of reality. Daniel, on the other hand, didn't ask questions. He respected her. But inside him, anxiety grew like a shadow that changes shape without realizing it. She went out later, responded less frequently, and when she was home, she seemed more concerned about the next email than about his presence. The day before the event, he proposed they go together. She smiled, hesitated for a second, and then said it wasn't necessary, that it would be something corporate, technical, boring. The word echoed in Daniel's head, boring. As if his presence was that now. He nodded, without arguing. He knew that insisting too much could push her further away. Sometimes, love is retreat. On the afternoon of the event, Isabella spent hours getting ready. There was something different about her posture. She chose a new dress, impeccable makeup, and a strong perfume. Daniel watched her from afar, sitting on the sofa with an open book in his hands, but without reading a line. When she left the room, he commented that she looked beautiful. She thanked him with a short, hurried smile and said she had to go. The goodbye kiss didn't happen. He pretended not to notice. He returned to his book, tried to distract himself, but the emptiness in the room seemed bigger than him. He turned on the television, then turned it off. He walked to the window. It was raining. The city continued on, indifferent to the internal storm that was beginning to gather. Hours later, Isabella arrived at the party. The atmosphere was elegant, filled with familiar faces and many unfamiliar ones. She walked among the people as if she belonged there. She chatted, smiled, and toasted. She felt alive, like she hadn't in a long time. There was music, laughter, compliments. There was also an insistent gaze that had followed her from the beginning. She noticed it, of course. And she also noticed the way he approached with confidence, as if he already knew something was waiting to happen. His name was on everyone's lips, an influential guest, an outsider who was now the center of attention. He complimented her dress, her hair, her perfume. She smiled. At first out of politeness. Then, out of vanity. And finally, out of an impulse that even she couldn't control. Meanwhile, Daniel was eating dinner alone, a simple dish, the same wine he'd bought for them both. He considered calling, but decided not to interrupt. He considered sleeping, but sleep wouldn't come. So he decided to go to the place where it all began, the cafe on the corner. The owner recognized him, asked for Isabella, and he replied that he was at an event. He ordered the same thing as always, sat at his usual table, and stayed there, amidst memories and thoughts. He felt out of place, as if he were off his axis. Something was wrong. And he knew it. But he didn't want to admit it. At the party, the hours passed, and the conversations between Isabella and the mysterious man grew closer, more intimate, more charged with attention she pretended not to notice. When he asked her to dance, she hesitated. But she accepted. In the middle of the ballroom, as they twirled and rehearsed steps, she felt weightless. As if nothing else existed outside of that. As if the last few months had been merely a gap between real life and that fantasy. And then, it happened. A kiss. Public. Long, full of unspoken intentions. A kiss she didn't stop. That she returned. A kiss seen by more eyes than she would have liked. Including those of someone who entered that room just to seek her out, without warning, without a plan, simply on impulse. Daniel watched her kiss as if she belonged to no one. As if he had never existed. There was no anger. No scandal. Just an internal silence that cut deeper than any scream. He turned and left. She didn't notice right away. By the time she noticed his absence, he was already far away. Far away physically, and now, emotionally as well. In that instant, something broke between them. Something that couldn't be fixed with apologies. Later, she tried to find him. She called. She texted. No response. He spent the night wandering the city, trying to understand how it had happened. Trying to remember when she stopped being his alone. The house, once a refuge, was now just a place where everything reminded him of what it had been. He sat on the couch, stared at the door, and knew he had crossed an invisible line. One of those lines from which there was no return. Isabella, on the other hand, upon arriving home and seeing the silence that awaited her, felt the weight of what she had done. She tried to justify herself, rationalize, say it was nothing, that she had been confused, that there had been no malice. But all of that seemed small compared to the gravity of what had happened. His absence, the lack of answers, the crumpled note in the trash, everything screamed that something had changed forever. She tried to sleep, but guilt was a noisy visitor. Her mind returned to the moment of the kiss, to his face, to the way he had looked at her before disappearing into the crowd. And there, lying in a bed too big for one person, she began to understand that certain mistakes are not regretted. That some choices leave a lasting mark. Daniel, silently, packed his things. He didn't know if he would leave the house or if she would. He only knew he needed to get away. The love that had once filled that place now needed air. Time. Distance. Deep down, he still didn't understand how everything had fallen apart so quickly. But he sensed there was more there. Something still unsaid. Something she was hiding. And what he didn't yet know was that the kiss, as painful as it was just the surface of the abyss. Because there was a secret behind that betrayal. And that secret was about to come to light. The silence that settled between them after the betrayal had a texture, a scent, a shape. It was dense, permeating the rooms, bumping into the furniture, and tangling in the details of the house like a fog that wouldn't lift. Isabella tried to act natural, but every step felt false, every gesture seemed overly rehearsed. Daniel, on the other hand, no longer made any effort to pretend he hadn't seen what he saw. His eyes no longer sought hers. His words were short, matter-of-fact, and there was an absence there that weighed more heavily than any scream. Their life together had become a coexistence of civilized strangers, sharing the same roof only by inertia. The betrayal was obvious, even if unspoken, and now hovered over them the question neither had the courage to ask aloud, why? It was on a random night, days later, that the dam began to give way. She'd come home from work early, and he was sitting on the porch, staring at the cloudy sky with an expression that mixed weariness and detachment. She paused at the door, hesitant, observing his profile against the dim light coming from the lamp nearby. She said nothing for a few seconds, until, without turning his head, he asked if she had anything to say. His voice was low, without anger, without irony, simply as if offering a final opportunity for honesty. She approached slowly, sat in the chair next to him, and took a deep breath before speaking. She didn't apologize, didn't try to justify herself. She simply said she knew he'd seen it. And that she would understand if he chose to leave forever. He was silent for a few seconds, then turned his face toward her and asked with firm eyes if it had been just a slip of the tongue or if there was something more to it. Isabella hesitated. She swallowed as if the words that followed would taste bitter. She said it was a mistake. That the moment had taken her. But before she could finish her sentence, he interrupted her with another question, this time firmer, more urgent, as if needing to tear the truth from its roots. Had that happened before? She looked at him as if her soul had been pulled from her body. She shook her head. She said no. And it was true. But he didn't believe her. And doubt was a knife between them, cutting what remained of their bond. That night, he slept on the couch. Not out of revenge, but out of necessity. The room now repulsed him. The scent of her pillow, which had once soothed him, now suffocated him. The next day, he left early, without saying where he was going, without leaving a note, with no timetable for his return. Isabella spent the entire day pacing the house, lost in memories and thoughts. She felt drowned in her own guilt. He knew what he had done. He knew the depth of the pain he had caused. But there was still something inside her that gnawed at her more powerfully than her own remorse. Something she never told him. A reason that didn't absolve her, but perhaps explained it. When he returned, it was already past 9 o'clock. She was waiting for him, sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by boxes of photos, old notes, mementos of a time when everything seemed so simple. He saw her there, her eyes watery and her breath shallow, and for a second, he considered going straight upstairs. But he didn't. He sat on the sofa, silent, waiting for her to say what seemed to have been stuck inside him forever. And that was when she began. She said she needed to tell him something. Something she herself had tried to bury. Something she'd never had the courage to reveal because she knew it would change everything. Daniel frowned, his stomach churning with anticipation of what was to come. Isabella brought her hands to her face for a few seconds, as if hiding from her own shame, and then began to speak. She said that years ago, long before that party, there had been a conversation. A quick, informal encounter with a man she'd met in college. At the time, they'd only been together for a short time, still building the foundation of their relationship, still learning about each other. This man, whom she described as someone from the past who had reappeared out of nowhere, made a proposal that left her confused for days. He'd said he still thought about her, that he regretted letting her go, that he'd like to have her back. She refused. She said she was in a relationship, that she was happy. But she kept that conversation a secret. She never told Daniel. She buried it as something unimportant. But it wasn't. Over time, that moment became a blind spot. A recurring thought. A what if that haunted her on her darkest days. When they began to drift apart, when routines clashed and silence settled in, that memory returned with greater force. And so did the man. He sought her out again. It began with subtle messages, then with casual invitations. And it was with him that she danced at that party. It was he who kissed her in front of everyone. And, more than that, it was he who manipulated her with words spoken at just the right moment, touching precisely on the insecurity she tried to hide from everyone, the fear of having made the wrong choice. Daniel listened without interrupting, but the tension on his face was almost unbearable. Isabella said the kiss wasn't planned. That she felt fragile, emotionally exposed, and that she'd fallen into a trap she'd allowed herself to be set. But what hurt most, what she hadn't yet said, was the real reason for that kiss. And when she finally found the courage, the revelation crashed between them like an earthquake. She said the man confessed, right there, after the kiss, that he only approached her out of revenge. Not love. Not desire. But wounded pride. Because Daniel, years ago, had turned down a partnership with him on a professional project that could have changed his life. He said Daniel had humiliated him, that he had coldly rejected him. And he promised himself he would make Daniel pay. That he would destroy him in the cruelest way possible, by making him see the woman he loved ripped from his arms in front of everyone. And he succeeded. Daniel was silent for long seconds. His chest rose and fell slowly, as if he were trying to keep his heart together by force. He stood, walked to the window, and rested his hands on the sill. The rain was beginning to fall outside. He said everything made sense now. The way she slowly moved away. Her disguised absence. The hesitation in her eyes. He said he didn't feel angry with her. But he couldn't feel pity either. There was only emptiness. A huge space inside him that had once been filled with love and was now filled with nothing. Isabella approached, put her hand on his shoulder, and said she regretted it instantly. That she realized, right then and there, how much she'd been used. That when she sought him out after the party, it wasn't just out of guilt, but because she finally understood that the love they'd built was greater than any illusion. That Daniel had been the right choice all along. But she only realized it too late. He turned to her. His eyes were red, but dry. He said he understood. That maybe she really had lost herself. That maybe that kiss had been just the tip of an iceberg made up of unspoken doubts, pent-up resentments, and unresolved needs. He said he forgave. But forgiving didn't mean forgetting. Or starting over. It simply meant freeing himself from the burden of carrying a pain that wasn't his fault. Isabella cried. She cried like someone who cries for everything they've lost, for everything they didn't experience, for everything they've destroyed. She asked for another chance. She begged, between sobs, for one last glimpse of hope. But he didn't give it. He said he now needed to learn to love himself as he once loved her. That he needed to discover what was left of him after everything. And that perhaps time would show them a new path. But for now, their paths needed to be separate. And so, her soul in pieces, Isabella watched the man who had always chosen her leave. Not with anger. Not with hate. But with the silent dignity of someone who loved until the end, even though he hadn't been chosen. 2 months had passed since Daniel's eyes last met Isabella's in that apartment, that night when everything they could possibly have felt between them faded away without fanfare. He didn't leave a letter, didn't announce his departure with speeches or symbolic gestures. He simply closed the door behind him, taking only the essentials, leaving behind the memories scattered across the furniture and the most sincere part of the love he once carried in his heart. The apartment seemed smaller now, stifled by memories that refused to dissipate, like the lingering perfume that lingers even after the body is gone. Isabella remained there for a few weeks, trying to maintain a minimal routine, clinging to any shred of normalcy. But the space, which had once been theirs, began to silently cry out his absence, until she, too, was gone. Daniel found shelter in a small, furnished apartment in another part of the city. Nothing there resembled the life he once had. There were no paintings, no stacked books, no notes left on the coffee table. There was, however, a different kind of peace. It wasn't the peace of relief, but that of a man accepting that he must pass through a desert before flourishing again. Work continued, responsibilities demanded his presence, and his friends respected the space he requested with their eyes. They didn't ask much, they didn't offer advice. They were simply there, discreetly, allowing him to breathe, without pressuring him to heal. It was on one of those cloudy days, between work and the silence of his new home, that he met Helena. Nothing romantic, nothing cinematic. It was an urban design event, he'd been invited as a consultant, and she was there as a guest speaker. Their eyes met between presentations, unintentionally. They chatted casually at the event's cafe, and he was surprised by the lightness of the conversation, the lack of any urgency. Helena was calm, articulate, with a look that listened before judging. In the following days, they exchanged messages about professional matters, then more personal conversations began, and before Daniel knew it, there was laughter between them. There was no rush. He wasn't looking for a new love. But when she reached out, he didn't back down. He accepted her slowly, carefully, allowing his heart to find a new rhythm. Meanwhile, Isabella was on another journey. After leaving the apartment, she moved in with a close friend, trying to regroup emotionally. The first few days were a silent chaos, pent-up tears, misdirected anger, shame burning in the back of her throat. But over time, she began to look within herself more clearly. She sought therapy, faced the mirror with more honesty, revisited her history to understand when she stopped being true to herself. She wasn't looking to win Daniel back, at least not immediately. She wanted to understand how she could have sabotaged something so precious. And in this search, she rediscovered parts of herself that had been dormant for years. She returned to writing, an activity she had abandoned when life became too practical. She went back to walking alone, drinking coffee calmly, listening to old songs without needing them to mean anything. And in this process of rebuilding, something beautiful began to emerge, a more conscious, more whole woman who no longer needed to hide behind excuses. Their reunion happened by chance, or perhaps by the kind of chance the universe arranges when people are finally ready. It was a Sunday afternoon, in an open park, where a literary fair was taking place. Daniel had gone with Helena, who loved cultural events, and they were browsing books when he heard a familiar laugh in the background. His body reacted before his mind. He turned slowly, and there was Isabella, sitting at one of the stalls, talking to an author he'd admired for years. She saw him almost at the same time, and time stopped for an instant neither of them could measure. He held Helena's hand tightly and walked on. They passed close, their eyes met, and what was unsaid became more eloquent than any words. She smiled gently, he nodded slightly, and they continued on. That night, Isabella wrote. For the first time in a long time, not to organize her thoughts, but to free them. She wrote about love, about mistakes, about how life teaches us through pain what we could have learned through love. She didn't send the text to him. She didn't ask for anything else. She simply accepted it. But fate, once again, had plans of its own. A few weeks later, during a get-together with old colleagues, one of their mutual friends invited them to a casual lunch. Neither of them knew the other was there until they arrived at the restaurant. There was some awkwardness at first, but the others made a point of treating everything naturally, which made things easier. During the meal, they spoke little. There were exchanged glances, suppressed laughter, but no tension. When lunch ended, they were both outside, waiting for the rain to pass. She spoke first, her voice calm, "You look fine." He smiled. He said he was rebuilding himself, and that it took time. She replied that she was in the same process. And then they sat in silence for a while, listening to the rain. It was at that moment that Daniel surprisingly broke the silence. He said there were days when he still remembered her fondly. Not with longing, but with gratitude. Because it was through the fall that he understood he needed to find himself first. She held back her tears. She told him he was right. That she had destroyed the best she had because she didn't know what to do with so much love. That she wasn't there to ask for anything, just to thank him. And in that moment, without drama, without pain, they embraced. A firm, sincere embrace that sealed everything that needed to be closed. The following months brought new beginnings for both of them. Daniel and Helena grew closer with maturity, building a relationship based on conscious choices. There was no idealization, only mutual care. Isabella, for her part, met a man during a writing course. Someone who arrived slowly, without promising cures, but with a willingness to build something together. And, over time, she allowed herself to love again, not as before, but more attentively, more generously, less impulsively. The forgiveness between Daniel and Isabella didn't turn into love again. It turned into respect. It turned into learning. It turned into the certainty that some pains aren't a curse, but a transformation. The love that existed between them wasn't in vain. It served to help each of them find their own essence. To help them learn to value what truly matters. And so that, in the end, they could look back without shame, without guilt, only with the certainty that they had grown. Their last meeting was brief, unexpected, in a bookstore. Both alone, both well. They chatted like old friends. They talked about life, books, and their journeys. They laughed over old stories. And, as they said goodbye, Isabella said, "Thank you for loving me when I didn't even know how to love myself." Daniel replied, "Thank you for teaching me that even pain can be the beginning of something good." And then, they parted with a light hug, like someone who finally understands that the end of a story can, indeed, be beautiful, as long as one knows how to learn from it. The morning after their reunion at the bookstore dawned with a rare, almost strange serenity, as if the universe had finally granted the two characters in that story a new lease on life, a respite between painful memories and possible futures. Daniel walked through the streets with a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time, lightness. But it wasn't the illusory lightness of someone who forgets, it was that of someone who forgives. The embrace he shared with Isabella seemed to lift from his shoulders the accumulated weight of years of hurt, frustrated expectations, and undigested silences. It was as if life were telling him that, yes, suffering had served its purpose, it had molded, transformed, hardened in some parts and softened others. And that day, he knew with clarity that he was no longer the same man who left the party months ago with his dignity wounded. Now, he was someone who had crossed his own abyss and arrived on the other side with his soul intact. Isabella, for her part, spent the rest of the day immersed in deep reflection, looking within herself like someone exploring an old house, opening forgotten doors and staring at the dust accumulated in every corner. When she got home, she took off her shoes and sat on the living room floor, surrounded by the books she'd been accumulating lately. She took a deep breath and wrote another page of the journal she'd started in therapy, where she poured out everything she couldn't say out loud. She didn't write for him, nor for herself. He wrote for the version of her left behind, trapped in guilt, doubt, and fear of being unloved. The woman who, for so long, believed she needed to prove herself, compete, live up to external expectations, when, in truth, all she needed was to learn to stand on her own 2 feet. There, with her pen gliding firmly across the paper, she understood that the forgiveness Daniel offered her was more than she deserved, and exactly what she needed to move forward. The days passed at a new pace. Daniel and Helena already had their own routine, guided by balance and respect. He liked the way she didn't invade his silences, but she also didn't allow him to sink into them. He liked the way she took care of the little things, as if she knew that true affection resides in them. Helena, in turn, admired the depth with which Daniel looked at the world, as if always searching for meaning between the lines. Their relationship wasn't made of fireworks, but of silent complicity, expressed in gestures and mutual trust. There was no rush, but there was commitment. And this, for Daniel, was a new way of loving, more conscious, less idealized, but no less intense. Isabella was also experiencing a new beginning. The man she met in her writing course was different from all the others who had passed through her life. He had a calm way of being, a genuine listener, a patience that didn't seem to come from the modern world. With him, there were no games or grandiose promises, but a daily surrender, a mutual choice that renewed itself in the details. He knew her past, knew the pain she carried, and never made her feel guilty about it. On the contrary, he told her that her scars made her more real, more human. And she, for the first time, felt she could be exactly who she was, without masks or disguises, without fear of not being enough. But there was still a dilemma within Daniel that wouldn't be easily resolved, an internal conflict that grew the more peaceful life went on. He knew he had done the right thing by forgiving Isabella, by moving forward, by building a new story with Helena. He knew he had been fair, honest, true to his own values. But sometimes, when he found himself alone in the silence at the end of the day, he was overcome by a question that insisted on returning: was the forgiveness he had given complete? Had he, even having turned the page, left some unfinished line, some misaddressed feeling, some word left unsaid? Because forgiveness, he discovered, wasn't an event, it was a process. An ongoing exercise in not allowing the past to contaminate the present. And there were times when, even at peace, he found himself remembering old scenes with a tightness in his chest that wasn't grief, but longing for a version of himself that would never return. One day, while organizing old documents, he found a box of forgotten photos. Images of trips, simple house parties, cloudy days that had become memorable. Among them was a note written by Isabella on a birthday: "No matter where life takes us, I will always remember that it was with you that I learned what it means to truly love." He read those words calmly, with the maturity he now carried in his gaze, and felt that the note wasn't a lie. It was true. True at that time, in that version of them that no longer existed. And for the first time, as he put the note back in the box, he felt that their story had, in fact, completely ended. Not with pain, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. Isabella, on one of her dates with her new partner, heard something from him that made her pause for a few seconds. He said, in a calm tone, "You still speak of him with great care. That's beautiful. It means there was love." She smiled, surprised by the way he viewed her past without competition, and replied, "Yes, there was. And when it's genuine, it never turns into hate." It was in that moment that she understood that she had finally ended that cycle. That she no longer needed to apologize for her mistakes, because she had learned. That she no longer needed to fear being judged, because she now lived with transparency. And that a true new beginning comes not when someone else accepts us again, but when we accept ourselves completely, with everything we once were and everything we can still be. Time continued to do its silent work. Days turned into weeks, seasons changed, and with them, feelings adjusted. Daniel and Isabella, though they followed different paths, crossed paths a few times, always with respect and a kind of calm affection. They weren't close friends, but there was a peaceful connection between them, as if they had both been through a war and could now sit in the shadow of peace, without the need to relive pain, simply contemplating how much they had grown. Helena was aware of these interactions and never felt threatened. Isabella, for her part, never tried to reverse the decision that separated her from Daniel. They both knew that the love they shared was profound, but that what they had now, in their new lives, was more sustainable. The moral complexity of what they experienced was never denied. Daniel knew that, even though he had been the victim of betrayal, he had also contributed to the emotional distance that preceded it all. He knew that love requires active presence, and that silence, however noble it may seem, can be corrosive. Isabella, on the other hand, learned the hard way that internal emptiness cannot be filled with external validation, and that the search for self cannot override those who love us. They both made mistakes. They both fell. But they both rebuilt themselves, and there is no greater justice than that. The dilemma, in the end, wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about what to do with what you feel after the pain. Daniel chose to rebuild with integrity. Isabella chose to transform guilt into wisdom. And in the space between these choices, a rare kind of peace was born, the peace of knowing that, despite everything, they went all the way with an open heart. And even though it hurt, even though it left scars, it was worth it. Because it was these scars that paved the way for the true love they would later experience, no longer with each other, but with others who knew how to welcome them in the right way, at the right time, with the right version. And that, in the end, perhaps is what matters most. In early spring, Daniel and Helena decided to spend a few days outside the city, a short trip to a peaceful spot among the mountains, where time seemed to pass slowly and the silence sounded like a gentle breeze in the trees. It was the first time he had accepted a departure from his routine to a place with no commitments, no scheduled meetings, no agenda. Helena had proposed the trip as an invitation to the present, and Daniel accepted without hesitation, as if he finally felt he could allow himself to live unsupervised. Upon arrival, the two settled into a wooden cabin with a porch overlooking a calm lake, and in that serene landscape, something inside Daniel began to quietly reorganize. For the first time in a long time, he slept soundly, without disturbing dreams, without old memories invading his rest. He woke to light streaming through the wide windows and felt the weight of years slipping from his shoulders. When he looked at Helena, lying beside him, wrapped in the white sheets and at peace, he knew with an almost physical certainty that he was where he needed to be. Not because the past no longer hurt, but because it no longer hurt in the same way. On the second day of their trip, as they walked along a trail surrounded by tall trees, they began talking about the future. Helena mentioned that she was thinking about changing careers, that perhaps it was time to leave the stability of her current job and pursue something more connected to her beliefs. Daniel listened attentively, as he always did, but this time, beyond listening, he felt a desire to participate in the construction of that plan. He said that, if she wanted, they could reorganize their lives so that he could also work more flexibly, perhaps remotely. Helena smiled, not so much at the content of the idea, but at his willingness to build something new together. It was unlike anything she had experienced before. She didn't want to fit into his life, nor did she want him to mold himself into hers. She wanted a third way, a life built from their encounter, where both could grow without negating each other. Another time, sitting by the lake, their feet touching the cool water and birds flying across the sky, Helena turned to him and asked, "Do you think we love differently when we've had our hearts broken?" Daniel took a moment to answer. He thought for a few seconds, staring at the reflection of the mountains on the lake's surface. He said yes. That we love with more humility. That we listen better. That we are more aware that love is not a guarantee, but a choice. And that this choice requires daily care, attention to detail, and genuine presence. Helena nodded gently, as if she knew exactly what he was talking about. They both fell into silence, but the kind of silence that comforts, that unites, that says more than words. On the way home, the trip had left more than fond memories, it had left a silent decision, a mutual commitment to move forward together, calmly and truthfully. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Isabella was also undergoing a subtle transformation. She had enrolled in a mentoring program for young writers and spent much of her morning revising texts, commenting on drafts, encouraging teenagers to find their own voice. There was something deeply healing about this process. It was as if, by helping other women express themselves, she was, little by little, reclaiming forgotten parts of herself. Her relationship with the man she met in the writing course was also progressing steadily. He was calm, unpressuring, but always present. He enjoyed cooking, listening to old records, and rarely spoke loudly. Isabella discovered she loved his silence, that silence that welcomed rather than pushed away. She no longer felt the anxiety of proving something, of making herself necessary. She simply was, and that was enough. Sometimes, she would watch him sleep with a sense of wonder, that, despite everything she had been through, it was still possible to feel it all again, only better, more clearly, with more presence. One afternoon, as she was leaving the mentoring session, she found an envelope in her mailbox. It was simple, with no return address. Opening it, she found a small clipping from an old newspaper, a column about forgiveness written by Daniel. The publication was months old, but she had never seen it. She recognized the style, the tone, the way he looked at pain with tenderness. She read it slowly, feeling each word as if it were an answer she hadn't even known she was looking for. At the end was a small, handwritten sentence: "Some wounds don't heal to hurt less, but to teach you how to love better." She read and reread it, holding the paper as if it were too fragile to fold. She smiled, not out of longing, but out of gratitude. She knew that, somehow, this was his way of saying that the past was truly at peace. In the following weeks, the two crossed paths twice more, always by chance, in public places. A bookstore, a market, an art event. There was no tension, no burden. There was a kind of affection that no longer required presence to exist. Isabella shared these coincidences with her new partner naturally, and he always reacted calmly, without jealousy, with respect. He knew the woman he had by his side today was different from the one who had made mistakes. And Daniel, seeing Helena smile, hearing her voice on lazy mornings, or receiving messages saying, "I arrived safely," at the end of a day, felt within himself the confirmation that loving someone who chooses you calmly, every day, was the greatest gift life could offer after so much turmoil. But not everything was so simple. Daniel's mother, a woman of old-fashioned values, learned of the friendly reunion with Isabella through a neighbor. And this caused unexpected discomfort. She never forgave what happened. She considered betrayal unforgivable, and while she respected her son's choices, she found it difficult to accept the idea that he could talk normally with someone who, in her eyes, had destroyed who he was. At a family dinner, she commented to Daniel, subtly but incisively, "We wash ourselves clean of mud, my son, but we don't need to keep walking through rain." The phrase stuck in his head for days. Helena sensed something was bothering him and, one quiet evening, asked him directly. He confided in her. He said he didn't want to live trying to prove his decisions to anyone, but that he felt a slight guilt for making peace with someone who caused so much pain. Helena listened attentively and replied firmly, "You are not weak for having forgiven. You are free for having achieved it. And no one has the right to make you doubt that." That conversation was a kind of liberation. Because, in that moment, Daniel understood that moving forward, with a clean heart, was what made him strong. That the pain he'd endured hadn't been in vain. That he was now a more whole, more aware man, and that his current love wasn't a patchwork, it was a clear, full, real choice. And it was this certainty that accompanied him on the day, months later, when he received an unexpected invitation, to the launch of Isabella's book. A collection of chronicles about new beginnings. She hadn't asked him to go. She simply sent the invitation with a note, "Thank you for being the starting point. I hope life is being kind to you." He read it silently, showed it to Helena, and they both decided to go. On the night of the launch, the bookstore was packed. Isabella wore a dark blue dress and looked more confident than ever. When she saw Daniel and Helena enter together, she smiled sweetly, nodded, and continued chatting with other guests. Later, when the three passed by the book signing table, they exchanged a few simple, sincere, and light words. Isabella looked at Helena with respect and admiration and said, "You have an incredible man by your side. Take good care of him." Helena responded gently, "I know. And he takes good care of me too." They both smiled, and in that gesture, there was more maturity than 1,000 apologies could convey. When Daniel said goodbye to Isabella, she handed him a copy with a discreet dedication, "For the one who taught me the value of choice, even when it costs us dearly." On the way home, Daniel sat next to Helena in the passenger seat and remained silent for a few minutes. She didn't ask anything, just waited. When he finally spoke, he said that night had closed the last open circle in his life. And that, strangely enough, he was glad he'd gone. Helena held his hand and simply said, "Me too." And so it was, through unexpected encounters, conscious decisions, and well-faced pain, that they arrived at this point, two lives marked by loss, yes, but mostly by courageous choices. Because love, in the end, is this, choosing. Choosing again, despite everything. And the hardest part, choosing differently when you've learned enough not to repeat the same mistakes. Years had passed since that night Daniel and Helena left the bookstore with a copy of Isabella's book in hand. Time, which once seemed like a cruel enemy, had now become a silent ally, bringing layers of understanding that only emotional distance can reveal. The days became less about the past and more about the carefully constructed present. Helena and Daniel were married in a small, intimate ceremony beneath a century-old tree, surrounded only by the people who truly played a part in rebuilding their lives. There were no grand speeches, but there was an exchange of glances that said it all: "I'm here, whole, without a trace of what broke me, ready to choose you every day." That night, as they danced slowly to an old song, Daniel reflected for a moment on everything he'd experienced up until that point, on all the versions of himself he'd had to abandon to reach that moment. And as he looked at Helena, there was no doubt, this was the right love, at the right time, with the right woman. Helena, in turn, found in Daniel not just a companion, but a mirror. Someone who, like her, understood that love wasn't about living in idealization, but about walking together even when the days were cloudy. She didn't want to erase his past, and he never tried to hide who he was before meeting her. Between them, everything was clear, even the silences. She taught him that affection also lives in routine, in pauses, in moments when one doesn't need to say anything to be understood. With her, Daniel discovered a love without urgency, where the present was worth more than any memory. And in that kind of love, he flourished. He never returned to his old apartment, never again sought answers in the shadows of his experience. His home was now. His choice was now. And this certainty didn't need daily reaffirmations, it was enough to be there, whole, constant, committed. Isabella also crafted her own ending, one many would never have imagined. The Book of Chronicles she launched that night became a quiet but consistent success. It didn't sell like hotcakes, it didn't win any awards, but it found loyal readers who saw themselves in the vulnerability of her words. Over time, she was invited to teach workshops in other states, participated in debates on emotional reconstruction, and was eventually asked to collaborate on social projects that encouraged women to start over after painful breakups. Her life took a new direction, and she discovered there was strength in what she had previously considered weakness. With the man she met in her writing course, she built a peaceful but nonetheless intense relationship. The two never officially married, but they shared the same dreams, the same roof over their heads, and the same willingness to care for each other with affection and truth. She never tried to rewrite her story with Daniel. She never used pain as an excuse, nor did she try to justify her mistakes. She learned to live with what she did, not with guilt, but with awareness. With him, she learned the value of being chosen. And in losing him, she understood that love is also caring, protecting what you have, being there when the other needs it most. For many nights, she wondered if he still thought about her. Over time, he stopped seeking that answer. Because the love they once shared now lived in a different way, in the maturity she carried, in the decisions she made, in the care she offered herself and others. She didn't see him again after the book's release. But sometimes, she would pass by the place where they met and smile, as if thanking fate for showing her, even through pain, what it means to truly love. One afternoon, with her life already stabilized, Isabella received a message from a young woman who had participated in one of her writing workshops. The girl said that, after being betrayed by her boyfriend, she thought she would never trust anyone again. But after reading Isabella's words and listening to her story, she understood that love, when lived truthfully, can be rebuilt, not with the same person, but with a better version of herself. Isabella read the message and cried. She cried not from sadness, but from an emotion that came from deep within, the feeling that her pain had not been in vain. That, somehow, her failure, transformed into art, was now helping others avoid making the same mistake. And that was when she understood the true purpose of everything she had experienced, to serve as a mirror, a warning, a path for those who still didn't know how to follow. Helena and Isabella never met in person again, but they maintained a cordial exchange through social media. They respected each other deeply. Each knew the role they played in Daniel's story. One as the love that failed to care for, the other as the love that embraced. There was no rivalry. There was no resentment. There was a kind of silent truce, a mature awareness that the human heart is complex, and that life goes on, even after the damage, even after the grief, even after a betrayal that seemed irretrievable. There was a mutual recognition between them. Both, at different times, had loved the same man, and were loved by him to different degrees. And this, however unusual, connected them in a strangely peaceful way. Time passed, as it always does. And one day, Daniel became a father. Not in a rush, not by chance, but by choice. Helena became pregnant after much discussion, much preparation, and many plans. When the baby was born, Daniel looked at that little being and felt something complete within him. It wasn't about closing old cycles, but about opening new ones. Holding his son in his arms, he thought about everything he'd experienced, everything he'd lost, everything he'd built. And then, he whispered tenderly, "You will learn that love is a choice. And that every choice has a price. I choose to love you. Every day." That was the last time he thought deeply about Isabella. Not with pain, not with longing. But with the clarity that she was an essential part of his emotional development. Part of the story that shaped him into the man who now had the privilege of teaching what he had learned. And in that simple act of loving a child, he forever sealed peace with the past. What this story shows us is that betrayal isn't just a momentary act. It's a crack in the soul of someone who trusts, a wound that transforms, a mistake that carries consequences greater than the impulse that caused it. But at the same time, it shows that it's not the end that defines who we are, but what we do afterward. Daniel had his heart broken, but he knew how to rebuild it without hardening it. Isabella made an irreversible mistake, but transformed the weight of guilt into learning and truth. Helena entered the story at the right time, not to save anyone, but to walk side by side with someone who was ready to love again. Leave your thoughts on this story in the comments. Do you think Daniel made the best decision by moving forward? Do you think Isabella truly deserved this ending? What would you have done in their place? We want to hear your thoughts, because stories like this are, ultimately, about all of us. Subscribe to the channel to continue listening to intense, moving, and real stories like this one. Here, you'll find heartbreaking plots that always bring an important lesson at the end. And remember, betrayal destroys homes, breaks promises, and breaks people from within. Nothing justifies hurting someone you trust. This channel neither condones nor romanticizes any kind of betrayal. Our commitment is to emotional truth and the real consequences it causes. May this story serve as a warning, but also as a reminder that, even after a fall, it is possible to rebuild, as long as it is done with truth, courage, and love.